Thank you so much for tuning in to Circling Dialogos. If you are inspired by what we talk about on this channel and want to dive deeper and in fellowship with others, there's a number of ways you can do that. One is to become my client and work one-on-one with me. We also have circling events every week open to the public. We also do weekend intensives for circling every 4 to 6 weeks or so. And we have a year-long Art of Circling practitioner training program. We also have self-study programs that you can do at your own pace. All the relevant links, including my email, is below in the show notes. Please let me know if you have any questions.
So there you go. That's the question for you. Just
Yes.
what is influencing what?
Yeah. That is the question, isn't it? That is the question. It's good to see you, my friend.
Yeah, mate, it's good to see you too.
It's been a long time
It's
since
been a few years now.
yeah,
Yeah.
years. And
Yeah. You've
I've just I've noticed what I sense is I don't know, a shift in some of the shenanigans you've been up to. Um in some of the video quality and graphics. It seems like you've been putting some more intention or deepening your vision in what you're doing on YouTube. I recently, I really,
yeah.
I really like the bigger discussion that you did around, and I thought it was, quite brave of you to do it around the Israeli-Palestinian thing going on. I really enjoyed that discussion a lot, and many of them. But I get the sense that it's something like what you're up to with this is more formed in your mind, or
Well, yeah, I was stopping myself from jumping in and swearing just before, So I'll go instead with the word. Well, hopefully I'm not quite as foolish
yeah,
with what I'm doing. The intentions really have remained very consistent. And if anything ever looks more aesthetically pleasing or if anything connects better, it's really probably just because there's been that many misses that eventually, kind of narrowing in slightly
yeah.
on what the communication calls for. Yeah. So in many regards, mate, it's all the same. It's all the same. And hopefully there's just a little bit more elegance, a little bit more mm, well, see, there it is. I still have the same calling to the silence that is that really touches straight on the relationship between generativity and the perception of instability.
Yeah.
And when
Creativity
it comes to
and ability. Hmm.
that's what was coming to me there, because here we are reconnecting, and I have already in me such a sense of what's possible to express with you, and and the many many hours of conversation I've heard of you over the years that we've shared. In a sense, there are deep waters in limited time we can immediately begin to work with, and then the more I, let's say, feel into and allow forth the unique expression of what it is for you and I to meet, well, that's one thing, and that might just in some sense be esoteric to you and I, and in the context of others potentially listening, And certainly in the context then of reflection on the cultivation of work over so many years with all these different perceptions of it, it's that process of opening up to include in that same quality of sensitivity and essentially a kind of truth, and real care for signaling out where with integrity there is in fact footing. Here we are, that as I reflect on that, as I tap into it, the orientation for what hand holds or what footings to step into becomes, yeah, well, one of the things it seems to work with is a relationship on the one hand between generativity. All right, if I drop in and settle somewhere, from there we can move, or I can move in that expression, and there's possibility. And then on the other hand, you know, setting up for too much of a leap, or maybe stepping out into too much of a descent or something like this, is the potential for a kind of instability. And when people view that, no matter what it is, I'll share with you just this one thing, and then because as you mentioned, the Israel-Palestine and war discussion, and we've had a couple of those, and yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I've become like quite confident, decent confidence in the perspective that when people are tuning into Piers Morgan to hear yet another interaction about this, right? Hundreds at this point, millions upon millions of views, hundreds of millions of views if you stack them all. They're not tuning in because they want to hear some generative conversation where, truth at last is spoken, apart from as comes from their particular preconceived sense of what is right. It's not about the quality of discourse. I think it's much more about sensing where the moving flock, where the moving herd is orienting. So the ones on the outside can be like, all right, how do I quickly not become isolated and alone in relation? Where's the herd moving so that if there are big breaks, if something happens, where am I in relation to that? Like, what's going down in the world? It's not bringing consciousness to a place of really seeking understanding. It's not really there to receive the deeper patterns necessarily. It's there to, and I notice myself, that's partly what's going on. I'm kind of perceiving where the state of play is, not because I'm attempting necessarily to in my case, I am trying to understand what's going on. But it's like when everybody started buying up toilet paper at the beginning of COVID, it's like, well, fuck it. May as well, eh? May as well get that toilet paper. No real time to slow down and sense whether or not that's a sensible thing to do in any way, but the herd's doing it and it's dangerous. So let's just go that way. And so it's kind of remarkable to me that for all the effort that really still remains central to me to put into cultivating contexts where the kind of interaction and communication that can really help to expand and deepen the possibility for understanding and a sense navigation of violence and orientation towards peace and from love and these types of things remains as central as it always has been. The continued relationship between how to be of service to that with respect to the esoteric and the exoteric remains very much central, and an unfolding mystery I continually find myself attempting to be in relation with. Yeah.
And I want to go back to what you said about this relationship that you brought up about where to start and what starting is, right? Between this tension or tonos or disequilibrium or possible equilibrium between generativity and, what did you say? Security?
Instability.
Stability. Yeah. Generativity and instability. Yeah. Do you think, I don't know if I've ever quite thought about that word pair before, like in those terms.
Me neither.
It's like It's funny. I in a conversation with Christopher Massapietro, I think we were talking about Dialogos when we were doing the Dialogos courses, every couple of months. And I noticed, I noticed we were trying to describe what it was. And I noticed the place from which we had to go to describe what it was. And it was like, there's something about it that you have to generate it anew every time. And if you have some kind of like talking point about it, it's so clearly not it. There's something about there are those things that only call forth a generative um, proclamation, right? And I've noticed that with circling, and I've noticed that like with I guess I noticed that with anything that you could call deeply significant, right? Event probably has something to do with eventfulness in character, um, and probably something to do with that sense of when whatever it is that you're talking about has that quality of a shining forth, right, and a withdrawing into the mystery. That those two places where whatever it is you're talking about, if it has to do with that quality, it calls forth a generative response. But yeah, man, it's clumsy. You can be clumsy as hell, right? And in that one time when you're not clumsy, right, you're done. And if somebody asks you like how you did that, you'll be the last person to be able to answer that question, right?
I mean, yeah, I get what you mean. My experience is that it depends how much gas is left in the tank because, well, maybe, I remember once sitting at a dinner, this is like 7 years ago, and this is, 7 years ago is when my attempts at speaking, again, to me, felt exactly the same. Maybe they felt, they felt different in the sense that I wasn't as trusting of my capacity to at least always connect with a few people in the room. And so, in that sense, I probably found myself in some social situations still a little bit more with, um, I don't know if it's about a point to prove, but having to prove myself in a way that probably drew forth more of a quickness of pace. I used to speak really quickly, and I speak oftentimes quite slowly now, but I can still speak very quickly if the time to compete is there, if the time to be really fine to the point, like if we were to have a disagreement and I was emotionally engaged, all of that capacity to speak quickly is still there. And in part, there's a sense of in such situations, um, I was used to, and one is used to not having any space on the channel. And so if only I can cram in all those 10 things that no one's actually even going to properly listen to anyway in that small time, at least then I've done it. And so there we go. Real quick. And anyway, I was sitting at this dinner and it was just like that. I said something and it was in response to probably a question like, what are you doing? But asked with enough significance where I'm like, all right, roll up my sleeves. Let me tell you, I got plans. And then someone else at this dinner table afterwards, and I didn't know a bunch of these people. One of them was just like, could you say that again? But it was the question, it wasn't like, I want to understand. It was, I bet you don't even know what you're talking about, such that you couldn't even say it again.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, roll up my sleeves. Let me just dip back into the tank. It'll come out completely differently, but it's from the same place, except now folding in the fact of your own attention too. But yeah, there's a giving, there's a real giving to bringing forth that which, I mean, you've got to rise to the occasion of your own sensibility. There's a sensibility for value and truth and possibility that one has to meet. One has to rise to that, and it takes energy.
Yeah. you know, I don't know if this is exactly the same thing, but I would imagine the difference that makes the difference around perhaps its coherence, right, of speech has to do with like the source from which it's being spoken from, right? Because I remember when I was younger, I started this is I think in my mid 20s, I started reading a book. It's just a brutal book, right? Um, The Point of Existence by A.H. Almas, and the title of it is I think it's something like so the point of existence is his word. The point is his word for kind of like the essential identity, right? And like his word for the essential personality is what he calls the pearl, right? So those are just kind of his terminology. He says the point of existence, and then I think the subtitle is something like um, awakening as the resolution of narcissism. I hope you're enjoying this video so far. Just wanted to remind you, if you are interested in diving deeper in what we talk about here on the channel, in fellowship and in a more embodied way, there are a number of relevant links in the show notes, including working with me one-on-one as a client. All the information is below, including my email address. And it's really amazing, right? And he's very into well, I would put it like this. There's a lot of people that talk about the connection between the psychological and like something like the non-dual, right? But in my experience, it's rare for people to actually draw out like the detailed like connections between where of the ego formation and the non-dual and where the non-dual goes. And he's got that kind of mind, right? And so he basically says, he talks about narcissism, and I think one of the first chapters is talks about the narcissism and in everyday life. And he just basically starts to point out that narcissism is like completely normal, but it's a fundamental necessary mistake, right? In that, right, knowing ourselves through inference. And he says, there's extreme versions of it, like I know that I am, right, by the BMW that I drive, or the hot woman that loves me, or all the things that I've done, and all the way down to the Northern California subtlety, the subtlety of my subtle body, right, infers me that I actually exist, right? And he's basically saying that, there's that one-ment, right, with yourself, or what you are, or you're at one, I would say, you're at one-ment with your thatness. And that is a very difficult thing to really, really know what that is, right? Like it's not a what, it's not a how. If you go to describe something like that, you're going to usually use hows and whats. But that, well, everything's there. So obviously it's something obvious. But when you actually start to think about that, what the hell, where is that, right? What does that mean, right? And so he's saying basically your thatness, right, is not something in its most authentic sense can be an image or reflected to you. And so it's the fundamental mistake in identity. But he goes to, basically he parses out the insidiousness, right, of the narcissistic, of the the everyday and the pathological versions of narcissism. And you just like, I have not, of all the people I've gotten to read that book, I have not had anyone like read that book and have it not just absolutely destroy their life at some level.
Well, I'll know what to think of you if you send me a copy.
But one of the things I started to notice, like And here I'm in my I'm in my mid 20s, right? A lot of your mid 20s is where that stuff is on high, because it's like, if you're not liked in the world, right? There's not going to be many opportunities open to you. So there's like also another level of this. It's like you are tracking how you occur for other people, right? And so all that's cooking through me, right? And I'm new in my profession. I'm like taking all kinds of risks, and I'm reading this book, and I'm completely seeing myself in the book. And I started to notice that that like started to pay attention to that, like when in an interaction, right? I started to, what was driving it was at some level, I'm trying to control, right? Like the way that I am an other for others. I'm trying to control some reflection that I think you're thinking of me, right? I'm trying to manage that at some level, right? And so I'm hyper aware of that. And one of the things I noticed is that I would start to talk, and whenever that thing would be at play, my my pace would go up, right? My the tone would go up. It's like I was speaking kind of after something. And I started to have these experiences where I would notice when I would end a sentence, it was kind of like I'd feel like almost like my face, like the skin of my face was just a little bit farther forward than my skull. And when I stopped talking, I'd hear this, I'd catch up to myself. This kind of sense of being ahead of oneself with, and I'd be like, I stopped talking, and I'd be, boop, and I left myself behind somewhere, right? Because there's this kind of quality of like something's got to happen here at like an identity level, and it was interesting. It was interesting working with that, right? It was interesting working with that, and but then I actually started to realize, like when I was speaking from a different place, right? Um, and I would especially notice this when I was like teaching and leading courses, like when a conversation, like because part of the courses is usually there's these course, the parts that I would always do would be kind of like the teaching piece before the experiential thing that we would go into, right? And I draw out some distinction, and I wanted to make it really, really experiential, so it's not just in your head, but people have an experience of a distinction, let's say. And sometimes that would go really well, and I'd be like, that's the greatest fucking thing I've ever seen, right? And I'd be high. And then the next course, I'd have the exact same conversation, and it just went flat. Right. And I'd just be like devastated. And I'd be like, okay, jig's up. This whole thing's a fluke, right? I'd feel awful. And I started to ask myself, what was the difference that made the difference between the two? And I started to catch sight of that for me, when what drove what I said was the relationship. When the relationship came first, right? That was always when it flowed. Right? That's always when it flowed. And when when it didn't flow was where something would happen or something wouldn't land with somebody. And instead of like staying with that relationship or with what happened over there or between us, right? I would imagine seeing myself in someone else's head, and I didn't look that great. And so what I would do is I would just do the thing that didn't work, but just like faster or harder. Like I would just start to do this, and I would totally disconnect. And the difference that made that difference. And so it was at this point where once I started to see that, it's not like I could control whether or not like I went into my head or something like that, or I disconnected. But the moment I realized I was disconnected, the one thing I could do is in that instant is bring my attention back to the relation, right? And maybe it just popped back out for a second. Sometimes it would just catch there. And I just started to note that. It was really interesting. At some point down the road, I don't know how long it took. At some point, it just became the thing that happened, where I could like show up hungover underslept, right? And or whatever, and show up and then just be able to go in and lay it out and have this kind of epic conversation. Because at some level, I was able to know where a conversation was, know where a generative conversation was, and when it wasn't, and bring that thing that thing in there.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you, and I feel I can relate to that very deeply. And yeah, I'd say it's one of the things I trust most, actually. It's one of the things I trust most. Yeah, there's a number of things. I mean, one of the ways I could give an angle into that phenomenon is through the lens of humility. You mentioned, in some sense, humility as a radical return, right, to the ground, to the soil, that kind of thing. At which point we're speaking about the relationship, which might not have been above the surface, but was in fact deeply informative of the patterns that were present. And one of the critical things is that what I've begun to emphasize more in the introduction, let's say, to context that I'm hosting or inviting, and it was probably the core undercurrent message of underground philosophy, which is a sort of a revamped live event effort I'm making in Melbourne, and I published part of that the other week. And I think in one of the clips that I'll share on some social channel, it begins with quite a strong claim, which part of me would maybe like to balance with, 15 other things. But it is, in a sense, exactly as you say. I think I said it's the quality of the relational field enables the quality of expression, something like that. So that the reception enables the expression. And you could think about the reception as, in terms of who the people are specifically and their present state of availability. And that's certainly relevant. But in the context of relationship, we're speaking about what's in fact possible to be with that can pass through the channel. In that sense, can what energy, what resources, what nutrients, what toxins can be related with in a way enabling of continuity and growth in that substructure, in that channel of connection. You can think about that as roots and networks and all that kind of thing. And so, yeah, this has just been very, very present for me for quite a long time, and sort of tracing out and attempting to understand my positionality, that kind of the my positionality that can tend toward a narcissism in the way you're kind of describing with respect to functionality in a network. One of the let's say the cases I'll make in favor of what might be, the baby thrown out with the bathwater of what might be contained in the narcissistic impulse. I'm only going with that for the sake of this conversation. It's certainly not how I would box it up, but is that it seems to be, while the sourcing of the value, whether the information, that thing to be brought forth, well, that seems to evoke an energy of its own in that sense, in the same way I've heard you speak about before, and people talk about the being written through, the being spoken through. In that sense, the vessel is receiving that sourcing and it bears its own energy. In terms of in a sense, like the energetic expenditure of holding open, of caring for that ephemeral relational connection as part of the logistical infrastructure of the possibility of interdependence and connection with other nodes or other beings. There's an energetic cost in holding open and sort of tending the vessel. So I said earlier on, while there's gas in the tank, can go back to that resourcing. I've certainly known what it's like to literally like talk myself into sickness, let's say. Like the number of times I've got ill after recording a podcast too late at night
Yeah.
or staying on for another couple hours. And for that time, I might be more capable, as capable as I am otherwise. Maybe not as balanced, whatever. There's certainly some trade-offs, but it's though I can keep on giving until then there's a collapse. And so there's something about the reflective self-evaluation of one's needs for value exchange in the context of the service to that broader context that then becomes this interesting relationship now effectively between enlightenment and economics. And that would be a bloody interesting pairing to speak about. That's for damn sure.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Oh, totally. I mean, I think what I'm hearing you say is that there's also, I mean, one of the things that we talk a lot about in circle, right? Which I mean, one of the ways you could look at circling is in some sense that practices kind of dwelling in that qualitative relational I thou place and just seeing how much we can, in some sense, um, speak the hyphen between I and now, right? And notice that. And and of course, this really involves self-disclosure, right? It's hard to imagine intimacy, right, that doesn't involve at some level self-disclosure, right? Um, and this, especially when people first start to practice circling, it's like it's so awkward, right? To like we talk about the first facet of circling is sovereignty, right? Like to the degree that I can be here with me, is to the degree I can be there with you. To the degree I can't be here with me, is to the degree I my ability to be with you is diminished. They're like a one-to-one relation, right? Maybe Vivek, you would call that the agent arena relation. Um, and at first, it's like there is this sense where people really have to go to a different part of their brain to go, all right, where am I? Right. And then who are you? Like at first it's this very awkward sense of things, right? And they forget to do it, right? Because oftentimes, like when we listen, we can get kind of like lost as a child's gets lost in a cartoon, right? Like kind of captive audience in some sense. And then we go, people go to speak their own experience, right? And instead they'll say, yeah, right now I'm feeling like you're really great, right? Where you get so captivated into what you're listening to or who you were for. So it is this very at first not obvious thing to track your own self, right? And what's happening for you, right? In relationship with somebody else. And so that's like I'm just very familiar with it. That actually takes something, right? Like it actually takes something to start to do that. Now eventually somehow, I don't know if this has some kind of synapses brought it or there's some neural net or however that works, but at some point people usually that starts to become a lot more fluid.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. Mm. Yeah, it feels like there's something here which mm. Okay, so as you were bringing your expression to a close, part of my desire for response went in the direction of the well, let's say the kind of saturation one can experience
Mm.
upon opening up to too many people because of what those potential openings ask for continued return
Mm.
and care.
Mhm.
And then there's the scale. There's a sort of there's multiple dimensionalities to the presence and the effort, let's just say the energy that is attempting to support that growing into capacity for others to relate with themselves and others. It's for sure the case that we can all strengthen in that person to person. Then the invariably the organizational, the institutional, the network flows at a level in which my valuation of myself and my effort as an agent to both to kind of to like what would be enlightened modeling is an interesting notion. I mean, one thing, enlightened modeling, I'm just coming up with words because let's
Right.
say here are some people who we wouldn't take to be enlightened, I would imagine. Let's call them you know, uh big finance stock traders
Mhm.
betting on the breakdown of the world for
Yeah.
their short-term gain. Okay. And yet,
Apples of
in principle, the modeling of where the energy in the system is going to go in the short term is pretty bloody good. And we might say it's unbelievably narcissistic, but it's extremely effective at recognizing how to interact in the broader value flow. And my sense is that these are very different competencies, sort of at one level, and yet they involve, or at least there's distinctions we can make, and yet they're fundamentally and profoundly connected.
Mm.
And
Mm.
it seems, yeah, and it seems like somewhere in there,
Mm.
that framing can also be applied at more local levels with respect to enlightened awareness around what energetic patterns are sustaining and enabling what, which cannot, and that intellectual analysis of that cannot mistake itself for containing or sourcing that fundamentality, which actually makes it all possible and worthwhile anyway, in terms of that common basis of capacity to be with and exchange in its beautiful sense.
Yeah. 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 I have a, I don't, let's just see if this connects with what you're saying. It's like, so, but I just want to base the gist of what you just riffed off there. Like, so what's the difference between the enlightened person, right, who can let go into a conversation that reveals everyone in the room's enlightenment, let's say, right, that involves some deep sense of being able to model, right, reality, themselves, the other people, and the economy between all of them. To be able to say just that one thing or not say that one thing in that right way, such that all of them pop open into God, right? But only forever, something like that. And then the guy on the stock exchange, right? Who's like, he's totally after just like, he's already got 1 billion, right? But he's after 10, right? And he's after it for all the power reasons like you can imagine. And he is making the calls and is rapidly modeling this dynamic system, right? That's even probably even more complicated than all the people in that room to grab that thing, and the race to the bottom continues, let's say, or exemplifies. And I think your kind of question is, is what has to do with this coherence and dissonance between these two.
Yes, so certainly that I suppose I was, I feel as though I can communicate various things about that coherence and that dissonance. And there's an interesting energy I have towards speaking into the depth of personal challenge I have in relating with those patterns. And then I have an interest that's a little bit more, um, it feels like I can protect myself more in sharing it, in articulating maybe some imagistic representations of how to strengthen maybe our shared perception of what it is at least I'm attempting to point to and what you're helping to illuminate. So and that and it's again it comes back to this interesting so instead of okay, so what I'll do is I'll just share the second one and just say I'm imagining mycelial structure. I'm imagining nutrition around this particular part of the ecosystem over here. And I'm imagining most of the basic connections around a couple of trees over there. But a lot of what both that mycelial structure needs and lo and behold, even the trees need, there's obviously exchanges going on. Turns out that there's some really viable material over here. But some of the initial hyphae that are extending out to meet that nutrition, the connections back, and here we're going to exhaust my knowledge of and how to speak about this, appropriately with respect to fungi. So let's just, make it up. But let's say that the connections back to that main root system are initially precarious. They're subject to many other things that are encountered in the soil along the way, which wants to eat the hyphae. And so, but it's actually come across some real nutrition. It needs to get that signal back. The effort toward strengthening those connections is well, it's just a very precarious situation. It opens up a lot of niches for short-term gain. And at the same time, it's also relating with, now just speaking metaphorically, potentially a lot of fear and uncertainty from the dominant or the main root system as to whether or not there's actually value really worth expending to go to this nutrition system. And so um, the someone could have a view of that and then look to support it or not, or look to profit from it or not. It seems like the energy required to open that bridge lets in the possibility for various sorts of influence to determine the allocation of various resources associated with what becomes in that system. And it seems like there's just different roles that seem necessary in opening up let's call them relational fields of possibility. And um, the banker is going out onto the street, and when they do, understanding what's wrong with the economy, not necessarily to step in and meet that in a relational sense,
Yeah.
but to plan accordingly.
Yeah.
Whereas to actually support the strengthening of the bridges toward nutrition and more sustainable nutrition involves a kind of skin in the game praxis. And so that there's all these different ways, therefore, that a kind of narcissism can come in. And I suppose the enlightenment is something I've come to think about, minimally in terms of the sort of natural flow and grace associated with the conduiting of energy, light, into the system with fewer points of, tension. I'm imagining like a muscle that's knotted, in that sense, is just able to give and receive with maximal appropriateness and efficiency. And that's truly a wild thing if one is also factoring all the many shadowed patterns of function which come to influence the real serious logistics for time, space, and energy of being together. But also there's got to be an acceptance for that. And so it's like, you don't get to know, how it all should be. And so there's a necessity of, in that sense, giving oneself to the possibility for exchange for itself. But my sense is that that quality is not selected for in contexts of power presently in a major way, because it is fundamentally destabilizing to the whole game. And we go more into that. And so yeah, a lot of what occupies some of my more, well, let's just call it thinking, is sort of an attempt to understand how to actually be in exchange with the right people, factoring the energetic landscape, given the tremendous weight that is just forever seems to crush, but can never totally extinguish that which can source its own nutrition, because there's always that deeper relationality to affirm or participate with in one's local ecology as it extends out in connection with others.
Yeah. So you said a bunch of things there. I want to make sure I'm getting the gist of it. So the enlightened person lighting up a room, and just that way, the banker pulling the levers of power, right? You brought in this metaphor, the mycelia, that there's a root from which they both arise, right? And they arise and actually do some of the same things at maybe different levels, and also at some the same levels, right? However,
Yep.
Perhaps very different outcomes. But then there's that part where it folds back into the root itself, right? Both these things fold back in the root itself. And in some level, how the hell does that thing know, right? What is it? The root. It's almost like I'm getting this sense of the root. The root somehow sent it out, and now it's coming back, right? Is it like, how does the root know what to accept, what to reject, how to adjust to all that? Is that kind of what you're asking?
That's a huge part of the tension and uncertainty, absolutely, because that's a part where it also involves what is uncertain and shadowed, and by definition has not, or at least has forgotten somewhat, maybe has never experienced, in fact, what is out there. And so then you're asking a gatekeeper who hasn't been to the horizon to determine what of the horizon is appropriate.
Yeah, totally. And so, and then you brought you made this link to like one of the things that consumes a lot of your thinking is basically what I heard you say is, I mean, to paraphrase what I heard was, I'm making choices to have conversations with people, right? With the intention to make the best choice, right? Um, by what I conceive is, what's most needed to like what makes the biggest difference, all the things that I know about and don't know about that are informing my choices. But I'm going for the best one. And how do I know to assess, right, that decision, right? Like I am making specific choices to talk with specific groups of people, and I'm really wanting it to be, I want it to feed back to that root, right? Something that deepens the root, let's say, right, in some way. But also, I'm also hearing in some sense you also being a kind of root,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
right? That like you being the recipient of those conversations and the consequences of those conversations, some of which you'll be able to like get clear information like that was good, not so good, right? But a lot of the
Yeah.
time, you know, we all end up anonymous at some point, right? Like we're built on, we're sitting in a, we dwell on top of the dead, the anonymous dead,
Right.
right? So who
Right.
knows what's going with what?
I mean, it's a beautiful question, and what comes to mind to me is just to reword that as the, okay, if I just do the words, it's dignity, vitality, narcissism. The question is how accurate, how firm, how grounded, how true am I in my self-perception and relational perception of the vitality that I am able to contribute to the context of that greater than, to the context of that network. And you know
Yeah.
um and that's a wild thing, because this is where, for me, if, like, where many of my issues, so my dad used to talk to me about selling and sales since I was probably like super young, because that's what he thought of himself as sometimes. But when he thought of himself as that, he really did think of himself as a really good one. And so it was something he liked to talk about.
Yeah.
And I just, and I feel immediately a pang of a kind of grief and sadness in a way, almost like letting him down in a sense, because I just basically always disagreed with my dad about about what sales was and about what it should be and about its appropriateness from a tiny boy. It just popped out basically like, I'm sorry, I can't swallow that.
Yeah.
And my sense has just been that the modern sales context is one that is always foregrounding. It's subterfuge. It's saying it's not. It's always foregrounding the needs to make a sale to the needs of the other to actually receive what's being sold, which is not to say there isn't something to the appropriate exchange or what would be the way to actually mediate that or signal value or anything else. But, you know, this is where what it is to participate in influence and what it is in some sense for, you know, to really participate in the allocation and the transmutation of energy in a context. And
Yeah.
I could say more, but maybe
That word, that
if you want
word,
to help me out.
that word participate. So basically, what I heard you say there was essentially there's a lot we don't know, right? And making this decision involves so many different moving things and so many levels, right, to consider, right? That there's some relationship to that there's something in relationship with, like, for when you invite someone into a conversation, right? You're basically not inviting everyone else, right? You're inviting this person, right? And you have a certain desire for that to contribute, right? And to be meaningful in a particular way based on your assessments of the whole. There's so many things going on there, right? And there's no certainty in that, right? There's not even any certainty that you can find out the consequence of that conversation until, like, after you're dead, right? So in some sense, how do I take that? How, first of all, I think the question I'm hearing in the background is, how worried about that should I be? And how seriously should I take it? Right? In some sense. And then when you said I'm participating in it, right? And yet we participate. I sense that there's something about that word participation with all of it, that I sense you use that word in such a way that had me think that there's a certain kind of faith of some kind you have in it.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd imagine you shared that, Guy. I think that's got to be what's close to the core of circling as well. In that sense, there's a well, that in a sense, it's that um, value doesn't merely reside in me,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Actually it is much more valuable to not be a narcissist.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's much better for the self to not be a narcissist.
Be a good idea if narcissists look in the pond actually realize that he's looking at his own reflection, right? It
Right.
would relieve him of a lot of stress, right?
Hey, it's a good selling point. We've got something even better for you. But it's interesting. What that reminds me of is that the very many seats of power and wealth, they don't know that they're the ones that need charity.
Mhm, mhm,
They
mhm,
don't know that they're the ones that need charity. And that in some critical sense, you know, it's not the money that they can exchange for time and energy in context and with people who can really help them to see and to know what they care about and to be of service to that. The monetary transaction of it really is, it's like a secondary or tertiary thing. And if the money is placed primary as a transaction in relation, it actually really damages, I think, the possibility to undergo that process or would be likely to. But the catch is that there's a certain amount of enlightenment then that's sort of necessary on behalf of the one who's in the position to give the money to actually recognize that. And so the dance of signaling there, because it's a wild thing, right? Okay, I'm imagining here now circling for billionaires,
mhm.
something that is surely needed. Okay. But what incredible asymmetry, because to the degree you're capable of, affording the context to really cultivate their being in that way, their relational being and their potentiality for it, they're going to wake up to an outrageous amount of asymmetry of energy to conjure it through their, they haven't, they didn't earn that wealth by virtue of their participation with the intimacy of, of relationality
Yeah.
necessarily.
Yeah.
So there's still this wild imbalance, and you know, to the level of intimacy capacity one would need to be a billionaire. It's like, really? Okay, I don't know. I ain't ready to be intimate with that person. Bloody hell. That is certainly not publicly. If one's a billionaire level of intimacy,
Yeah.
that's, you know, that really is, that's a place for the old cathedrals. So,
It's
yeah.
funny you mentioned that. I actually am working with somebody one-on-one right now. It's a client of mine who's essentially he's in a position where he's already quite wealthy, but he's getting ready to do something that's going to make him like at a totally different multi-billionaire, basically. And he senses, right? He senses that leap, and he senses like, am I capable of that? Like he senses some kind of, there is a leap that he's contending with, right? Um, and I thought that quite astute in some sense, right? Just to quite wise actually to just even perceive that we're not just talking about more of something I already have, but somehow being able to feel into the socio-economical, everything from status to the range of possibilities and all that that entails, like that, then he senses the transformational nature of that, right? And he's got questions about it with himself, very intimate ones, right? So it's really interesting, kind of like that you mentioned that, because it struck me as wise of him and rare, probably rare, because I would imagine people just run into being a billionaire like that. That's the thing. Of course, we want to go there or something, and then they have,
Buy a plane. Just fucking buy a plane.
yeah,
Buy an island.
yeah, yeah,
Buy all the houses. Buy the water. Buy the energy. Buy the food. Buy all the assets. Just buy all the things.
yeah,
You know.
totally. So there's this, you know, there's something about there's something about wisdom that I think we keep touching in on, right? If we say wisdom is you know is something like is something like well, I think Peterson talks about, wisdom is knowing what knowing the right thing to be terrified about, right? Or maybe a more positive way of saying that is it's the wisdom to know, right, what is truly most significant, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like, and I think that's kind of I remember on I think it was on a Facebook post, someone was asked this, the people post these little questions, and one was like, if you could master just one skill, right, at the expense of all of their skills, what would be your one skill? I don't know if I answered it or not, but I ended up thinking about it. I walked away thinking about it. What would be that one skill? And for me, my my estimation would be, if I had the skill or capacity to in any moment know where to put my attention, know the right thing, the
Mm-hmm.
most significant thing to put my attention on. It seems like everything flows out of that. Like if I am maxed out in like mastery of skill galore, but my attention's on the wrong thing, I will just apply all those skills to all that, right? And so one of the things I think I have faith in about participatory practice, like a participatory orientation, especially a relational participatory orientation, right? Is that there's something about it that isn't implicitly, in some sense, explicitly, is somehow a training towards that ability, right? The continual, well, I think our friend John would say, relevance realization. And I think that there's something particularly in like uniquely in a relational context, like given the qualitative nature, the qualitative dimension of the relational context, right? Not the quantitative sense. Obviously, there's things you can measure, but that's not what's happening. The thing that's happening is a qualitative dimension. So knowing where to bring your attention, right, is constantly what you're doing, right? Knowing what's the most important thing to say, what to ignore, all of that. So in some sense, the participatory act, right? In some sense, I think I have a faith that it's it's a training in that. It's a coming.
Yes. Yes. No, I agree with you. I So this language of giving and receiving, for me, about 10 years ago, I don't know if we've spoken about this, but one of the core necessities of my own, what I refer to anyway as my own philosophical work, but really that's just a word to mean deep engagement with, like, deep caring about significance and how to meet that as an identity as one way. And phenomenologically, the experience of meeting, the encounter of, let's say, uh, the potentiality for orienting attention
Hmm.
was imagistically represented to me at that time as a wave. In the same way you're in the sea, it's coming.
Yeah.
There's respond. The time to respond is coming. And so the language I used was confrontation and surrender in
Yeah.
relationship to that encounter. And then
Yeah.
there are two modes of confrontation, two modes of surrender. But in some sense, one can look at that as when to receive and when to give.
Hmm.
And one can, in that sense, be giving from that place which has these kind of like appropriate vitalities of the essence of dignity. It's like, I'm worth it. I'm part of it here. The influence is, and here's me stepping forward with influence, right? To meet this moment. In that sense, I'm offering something to hearken to in shared attention. And then in that, let's say the negative confrontation sense is perhaps when we should in fact be receiving, but instead we're bringing that forward, and you can imagine a particular kind of mode of um, pointless debate in some sense, where everybody thinks they're wielding the sword of truth, but really it's just you know a fight among dickheads would be the archetypal way, where no one's really any better off for that. And then in the case of the reception and the surrender, it's what an incredible thing to truly receive, to actually open up and receive. But of course, it's also possible to open up when we really ought to stand our ground instead
Hmm.
as well, where that inner sense of our own value, our own dignity is like, no, I'm here. If I open myself up to be treated like that, I am, you know, letting in a sense, a kind of, you could think about it in terms of toxin or pollution into the system. Now, none of this needs to be seen in overly moralistic terms, given the tremendous, fractality of this and its ongoingness, but just in terms of orienting in relation to cultivating that sense of attention, how this becomes for me is, to really concretize it in the real of, let's say, an argument with a significant other or someone one cares about. Uh, am I am I here speaking from a depth of my own sort of where need meets pain in a manner that is helpful or not helpful? Is it appropriate instead for me to return to breath just for a moment and to actually receive the perspective of another that can orient this situation? Otherwise, there's better ways, poetic ways to say all of that, but it's so real for me that that surrender to humility and what it is to apologize and what it is to strengthen that trust in one's orientation
Yeah.
in the chaos of that unknown of what to do with attention. And that's underlined philosophically, that's underlined everything I've done. That's underlined the whole approach to interaction with identity, because it just seems that that process is, if we slow it down enough, something like that is taking place. Um, and it seems to me that something like that, if I extend that further, it seems to me that from a process philosophical perspective, I think you can plug this into a very Whiteheadian view of things, and plug this in as well to a Hegelian view of things, and Jung even, and just the multi-dimensional nature of the psyche. And um, it seems like the quality of participation that you're naming there is the oftentimes unspoken necessity for philosophy that above all was undervalued for quite a long time in the West. And I think, and I say the West just because it's what I've experienced, but I imagine globally. And it's a remarkable thing. Um, yeah, no philosophy without spirituality is what I would say in that regard. No philosophy without spirituality, no philosophy without skin in the game, participation in the world, no philosophy without like imminent, immediate care in relationship.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're literally not strengthening what it is to participate in connection and coherence and identity and unknowing itself. It's like so obvious. It's so obvious.
Yeah.
But it's not about here how obvious it is. It's about, oh, okay. Oh yeah, actually that's what I'm doing. Okay, yeah. And actually, only I, that you captain your own ship, and that's a beautiful thing. So,
The self-correction,
mhm,
the self-correcting attention, right? This
mhm.
self-correcting sense of things. You can just funny. It's funny. I just really kind of got this sense of like you could just from the way we're talking about, you can really just feel how pernicious ideology is,
Mm.
right? I heard I talked with Jordan a while back about this, about a tweet he put out. He said the opposite of ideology is relationship.
Mm.
I'm
Mm.
really kind of getting the sense of that. Like
Mhm.
it's that even if my ideology is the deepest that anyone can perceive, right? Conceive of, right? If it's ideological, if it's fixed, if it isn't self-correcting, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what's coming to mind there is an ideology is a fragmented, fixed assessment as a map of what the good is, of what right is, and relationship in this sense is dynamic participation. And so you have the fixed dynamism thing being super crucial to that distinction, I think.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And I think to your point about what you brought up, basically what I heard you say, it's like, yeah, being in like a relationship that I happen to want to keep, right?
Right.
Like that requires a kind of self-correctiveness, right? That goes very, very deep.
Yeah. And because the image of what we are
Mhm.
seems to be so necessary to actually logistically meet the demands of the world. And it's, we'd have to go into the complexity of that because, of course, the image alone cannot do it. And then we could also speak about image as, the image I've had of what it means to be a father, of the necessities of what fatherhood requires. How long have I been forming that? How deep is that? How attached am I to that? What is it to relate with that? So there's obviously a lot of different ways we can mean image, and this sort of the base of, you know, psychical process that it's cultivated in and attached to. But certainly I, you know, I recognize that it is easier. I would say it's more straightforward. There's paths of uh, there are least resistant paths to economic reward in the world if one takes the way of ideology, which is, I mean, certainly in the media space, right? um, certainly in the media space. But it's kind of why we began this as well with, well, what influences what, and then that relationship between generativity and instability.
Mm.
Well, relationship is fundamentally generative and also is always in relationship with instability. And one wonders why there's such an issue with real growth and what have you. And OG Rose often talking about, we're not taking the question of how to create demand seriously enough. And you know, certainly value generation and desire have been core interests to many people. But yeah, there's something about the pre-scriptedness of what it means to contribute to society, which is actually eviscerating the creation of value, which which isn't to say we don't need to train skills that have already been mastered before to meet needs we presently have. Like there's plenty of ways to be nuanced about this, which are really, really important. But there's something about the radicality of innovation and to actually be on that, to approach that with something orienting and caring for wisdom
Mm.
that it's just not that's the wild thing. It's like the home of value generation. Is it? That's the thing. We have this view that it's war and the market, and particularly when shit's really hitting the fan, that brings out innovation, right? And yeah, it brings out innovation in weapons and maybe the kind of efficiency that enables communication to get resources here and there so we can fight better. And I'm not like wanting to diminish I'm not just wanting to run roughshod over that and sort of certainly not run roughshod over the value of the competitive spirit that wants to improve to win even a particular game. But there's something about the core of value cultivation and the mediation of desire and the expression of desire and the orientation toward what matters, that deep, obviously, that artistic sensibility. Its home isn't in the market and its home isn't in the government. And um, essentially, to try and support the praxis and proto organizational relational context that can actually support the birthing and cultivation of artistic sensibility and the cultivation of, OG Rose would say something like, what do you say, aesthetic form or something like this is we were talking about the other day. Yeah, that seems to be close to the core of what I find myself most aligned in working with people to create. And fortunately, in that,
So I
go
get that
ahead.
OG Rose, the thing that you're aligned. What is that? That which you're aligned?
It's effectively that which can collaborate toward the essentially the 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 fertility and potentiality of yes relationship, but I'm also speaking to this generative artistic component. It's
Yeah.
something like that which can um that which contributes rather not say it like this, that which contributes of its essence
Yeah.
to beauty.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Yes. 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 Contributes to beauty. Yes. So like you could have said good, you could have said the truth. You said beauty.
mhm.
And I would imagine we could interchange those at some level, but like I want to hone in on why beauty, you think? What has you?
Well, there's I think it's a matter of imminence and proximity. I've shared many conversations with people about this. This is one of those times where if this were a voice craft session, this is where and Mr. OG Rose, why don't and he would step on in and now I can certainly speak to it, and many people can. That's the beautiful thing. It's this question, this question I've attempted most of all to exemplify in response through invitation because there's well I'll just respond directly. I think that there's it's on the one it seems to be closer to the relationship between sort of uh, risk, trust, humility,
Mhm.
and self like an immediacy of presentation. There's no, you
Yeah.
know, the one can't pull the wool over the eyes in the same way,
Yeah.
you know. So there's a revelatory aspect because one of the things I'm particularly caring about and concerned about is the capacity for mimicry and script to propagandize and influence in that mode.
Yeah.
And given the amount of sensocratic
Yeah.
censorship and modulation, nudging, um, the notion of really private spaces is, a bit of a myth in a way. And yet the tremendous protection, I think this is like a really, I've been attempting to, this seems to me to be really profound as a, like I'm investing a lot in this. We'll put it like that. I'm investing a lot in this and it's not because I'm outside of it knowing it for sure, but because it's a promise and
Yeah.
there's an investment of hope. And it's that the the interior, in a sense, that you and I are sharing in this field, in this possibility, that our mutual perception and capacity to contribute and tend the quality as a kind of beauty of the possibility of the exchange, even though it can be looked at from the outside, it's actually not penetrable by anything other than what is either of its own essence wanting to contribute to it or is clearly wanting to destroy it. And that makes, hopefully, that makes, subterfuge in that regard is not, let's just say I just think there's a profound anti-fragility in that. I think there's a profound anti-fragility in that.
Yeah. 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 Just draw, I'm struck by, I'm getting a sense of, the whole arc of the conversation, right? In some sense, somehow that we're talking about beauty, right? It's like all of a sudden I can feel the through line of this basic underlying question is how do we orient when we generate when we generate in a in a groundless in a groundlessness that calls forth responsibility, right? And
Mm.
like in 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 kind of feeling, I had this sense of feeling our way into what the hell orients us there, right? What is the thing that orients us there? Because in so many respects, so many of the things that we can easily grab to orient us are actually like an ideology of some respect, right? Like a cult, like all the different things, right? End up being idols, and there's so many ways to deceive oneself. But when we say beauty, there's something about that where all of a sudden I can feel the deep compass.
Mhm.
And I would imagine there's something about like there's that element of beauty that um actually I think I heard OG Rose talk about it the other day of this way that beauty kind of pierces through, right, all
Mhm.
of our self-enclosure, right? There's something about beauty that just there's all these kind of these philosophical kind of perennial debates about like which one's first or the most, is it good, is it the true or the beautiful? And there's someone who argues that beauty is first, right, even before the good, because it's the one in which it draws you in, right, in
Mm.
a way that is beyond your own will. It breaks through all of your self-enclosed subjectivity, self-centeredness, all this kind of stuff, and goes boom, right? And you're in some sense, it's entered you by the time you can think about it. It's like it's the real. It's the way the good and the true can even like truly manifest, right? And puncture through it. Without beauty, there is no sense of a deeper mystery being able to enter us in some sense. Um,
Mm.
I was having
Mm.
has me recall this really cool conversation I've been thinking about ever since with my wife. Like I moved when after T. I have a 2.5 year old, and it's my second child. I have a 21-year-old and a 2.5 year old. Um, and there's two births I've witnessed. Right, there's the birth of Teague, and then there's the continual birth of my wife being, oh my God, that she's a mother and that's what she was designed for, and that she had no idea until it happened. Right. So this is kind of these two births, like watching her being continuously birthed by being a mother, and the birth of this little miracle. Right. And so needless to say, he's a big topic in our house. And it was just the right moment, right? Where I got home from a trip and the grandparents were gone somewhere and Teague was asleep, and we were just had a rare moment of sitting together on the floor in the living room, and we start talking about him, and she starts talking about this. She starts talking about these ways that he shows up, right? And she started talking about like there's these moments where it often arrives with him where he's disclosed in his absolute adorableness, like his absolute cuteness. It's absolute like utter like he's so adorable that you just want to eat him, right? There's something almost frustrating about it. If like you've turned up the volume on the adorableness, you just have to like you'd have to you hit some limit, right? So there's
Hmm.
that experience. And then she says something really interesting. She's like, but then there are these moments where he's beautiful, right? You can just feel you get we it's like we just know, even if we can't bring it into words, that difference, right? There's something fundamentally different. And we so of course I got interested. I'm like, what's the difference, right? And where we kind of landed was she said she said she said that I think when he's cute, it's usually disclosed in kind of what he is or how he is, right? There's some kind of what how thing going on there, right? That discloses him in the dimension of cuteness, right? But there's a certain it's strange that it's not infinite, right? Like you can't take too much of it, right? There's some kind of finitude involved with it. But when he's beautiful, is like it's the disclosure of that he is it all, right? And there is a sense where there's something about that experience that you can turn the volume up on that forever, and it would just be increasingly opening, right? In some
Hmm.
deeply nutritious way. I mean, I'm sure, like if it's too much, you'd flip into some kind of horror or disorientation or something, right? But
Okay, so okay. So that's super interesting. The flip to where the beauty could become a whore. Now, let's, I think we can also, in some important sense, I think there's I'm not wanting to like name that as of no value
yeah,
or in its own way not in service to beauty, but nevertheless, there's certainly something about that which there's an important distinction, an important transition of a kind of how we're looking at the dynamic. And I think that one of the reasons why, there's an inexhaustibility to beauty is partly because of, well, we could say our relation with maybe lack of beauty, and certainly our response, the necessity of responding to sort of to being worthy of beauty, which is to say to contribute to beauty, and where that beauty, you know, um, I imagine and I see beauty most in that which seems to also have in it's a speaking to potential, and it's a speaking to potential which has, well, real potential value to share in the context of ecology. So, you know, imagine a young boy becoming a young man, and the young man becoming an older man, and maybe what you can see in their particularity and the increasing, cracks on the skin that come about might, I keep searching for a different word to portend, because portend has this slight negative connotation, but I mean, doesn't it? And so I mean, like when you see something and it evokes, I suppose, it evokes a
yeah,
potentiality that's maybe of a certain particularity,
yeah,
and it's it's a it's an impetus, it's an invitation, it's a promise toward a contribution back into that context of belonging as that beauty,
yeah,
whether it's the community we can build, whether it's how we can honor or interact in the context of a forest or
yeah,
other patterns, or as we get older, how we can give back in that sense, how we relate to death. And it's kind of like it's sort of like the beauty is ephemeral in part because it's pointing it, it contains its own transcendence. It's that relationship between finitude and transcendence. It's kind of like a transcendence which is also bound by its finitude. It's pointing at
yeah,
the beyond, but
yeah,
it's also particularized in a
yeah,
way that marks its um, time horizon
yeah,
and in that sense, there's a preciousness about it.
Yeah.
And so there's a call to that comes with that preciousness, because you know, we move through phases of life and those calls change. And I suppose in a context of the whore, although you could look at that in a number of different ways, there's, you know, the in a sense, the work of the prostitute is, you know, it's rarely, I suppose, it's kind of sexuality in a way. It's sort of sexuality, oftentimes stripped of pregnancy and actual propagation. So it's kind of a shadowed contribution, which is also mired in a whole host of potentials for, uh, you know, toxic type of cycles, which, you know, but at the same time need not only, I think, be construed in that way. And yet it's like one thing's, it's so, you know, it's so tricky. There's like a whole space for a conversation about this, which I think is really interesting. And I don't want to present like I have a fixed sense of what the truth is in these regards. I know of a number of different angles in this exploration that I think are really, really valid. And I do think there's something really on the pulse of relating with that precise dynamic.
Yeah.
And yet, my sense is that it's mostly looked at with a kind of immaturity, and in the context of immaturity is not a beautiful thing.
Yeah. My friend, excuse me, my friend Mark Lewis speaks of beauty as, I love this quote where he says, beauty is only as deep as the observer.
Hmm. Yeah.
There's some deep, there's some deep training that beauty does or can do, right? And it's like, you know, you think about this as like, what is it to want to be aesthetically arrested? What is it to desire it? What is it to yearn for that, right? Like in some sense, I've been playing around a lot with this idea of, you know, this sense of, you know, a lot of times we think about desire and we think about desire as like something like a drive, like an innate drive. Like we don't have really any control over what we want. We find out what we want. And at some level, that's really true. Like I find out I like broccoli or don't like broccoli or something like that. I find out I want that. There is this element where it's like there's something that's like totally not up to us. But then there's this element where I actually think that we could want, right? We can aspire to desire things.
Mm.
Right? And in some ways, you know, I think it's pretty easy to say it's like in some ways we learn to desire things from the people that we grow up with. We learn to desire things, right? So there's this education of desire that I have a sense that beauty has a lot to do with, right? Because if you wonder, like, you know, in some way, you'd want that millionaire who is about to ready to become a billionaire, right? Like to aspire to desire. By the time he's a billionaire, he's already desiring something deeply good, right?
Mm-hmm.
In some contributive way, right? Something like that, right? And if he desires that, if he longs for that, right? In some sense, like that handles a lot, right? If I just actually want that thing, right? I'm going to be oriented that way. But I don't hear it much talked about, like about the education of desire, right? And what educates desire, right? And I think
Yeah, I think that's
we're close in the ballpark of something like that in this conversation we're having.
yeah, I think that's right. I don't know if you've heard me speak in the kind of philosophy which is the kind of the 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 baseline way in which I think about the cultivation of culture. I think about the relationship between belonging, education, and contribution, belonging, learning, and contribution.
Huh.
And belonging in this sense would be I don't know, how much do you know? Have you spent much time reading or potentially interacting with Forrest Landry?
I've seen a bunch of videos with him in it, including some of yours.
Right.
I
Yeah.
haven't, I haven't had a chance to talk with him.
Yeah, got you. I haven't. That would be an interesting one. Yeah. Hmm. I haven't spoken specifically to him about this. Oh, I did mention it once, actually. Yeah, I did mention it once. Anyway, um, belonging in the context of the way he thinks about metaphysics and triples would be in the immanent modality, which is just to say in kind of like a in presence with, if we are not born into a context where belonging is present, we will not be here for very long, right? In a sense, that's the kind of like, it is a givenness, but it's not a givenness that just that requires nothing of us.
Yeah,
We have to contribute to it. So if we think about belonging as the context of the fire, we've got to bring the wood to the fire and whatever. We also have to learn how to gather it safely and learn how to start the fire. But it's also the case that we do seem to be like the in that sense, the beauty we are born of has its own capacity to contribute that then we need to learn from. So the learning and the contribution can be switched around in their ordering in terms of their return back into that belonging. And yeah, it's tricky because in the context of this deep collaborative artistic relational endeavor, which I would sense you and I are care about very deeply, there is a an educational aspect to that. Um, it's also one that, you know, is needing to call to those who can contribute to it. Also, before it's not like you come through this particular pathway only, and that's the only way you get to contribute to this thing. So there's this very interesting dance between, you know, connecting with people who, in that sense, are the ones who are responsible naturally for actually the quality of the beauty in the field. And yet there's also a role to sort of pointing at and attempting to articulate,
yeah,
here's where some nutrition is,
yeah,
and maybe here's some living history that can be trusted.
yeah,
So it's a very interesting peer. That's why I think about it in terms of the praxis of ecology. And this conversation with John really trying to emphasize that the teachly authority is important and the cultivation of practices are important. But there's something about the formation of valuation in this really proximal sense, in this really fundamental sense, in this mycelial sense. That's this dance of what we ourselves are needing to learn and what we have to teach and how we can contribute before things can become structured almost
yeah,
in the manner that we're so used to thinking about structure, because it truly is a very radical thing, a real return to the roots type of thing we're talking about.
yeah, yeah. So I want to get because what you said I think is kind of like I want to make sure I really got it because I think what you're pointing to a dimension, a sense dimension, right? So I want to make sure I understand what you said. Like, so you're talking about, yeah, practices, right? Ecology
Hmm.
practices,
Hmm.
but well, let's say ecology, there's some, um, there's something that almost like there's a certain, like there are artists, there is another role of one who points to where nutrition is, like the artist, right? Like what the artist makes, like the practices, like all of that. That and part of their role is this, I don't want to, I call it conversation that is somehow opens the dimension of sense for the ecology to become ecologically like that. Like,
I mean, I like that. I think you're certainly adding, fidelity and a particularization to what I was saying, which I appreciate. There's certainly a role for a particular kind of, yeah, conversation, as you say, in that. I'm also sort of referring to I'm also sort of referring in a sense to the mess. Now, this is a funny one, one can imagine uh, when one meets a beautiful woman for the first time, but finds her beautiful, perhaps she becomes his wife or not. But it's archetypal, that moment of being not necessarily in massive flow, right? You've been caught up a little bit, maybe, but the potential for choking is quite massive. So
yeah,
how will you meet that moment? It can be quite messy. So
yeah,
there's something about the mess of treatment of the possibility for deep beauty,
yeah,
which is not containable, and it's not found. I don't believe it's found. It certainly can't be contained by any practice. There's an encounter to it which
mm,
can always transcend any particular held space,
mm,
and so there's something about that which is of the essence of potentiality, but also potentially destabilizing.
yeah,
And I do think the navigation of that in the context then of conversation, as we're speaking about, is, I think it's a profound service. It's a real value that's being cultivated and generated, but it doesn't have a place of reward in the context of present structures,
yeah,
institutionally, in government, or in market. It's literally not taking place to the degree, it's not of those modes.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and yeah, I mean, so look, if we want to like double click more in terms of how these thoughts develop for me sort of strategically, I do think there's a promise, and this is explored sometimes explicitly, often implicitly in the context of the podcast. Um, but I do believe that the analysis of, let's say, paradigmatic shifts and the opening of new mediums,
mm,
let's just say paradigmatic possibility, um, does open potential for, you know, new formations, or more newer vital formations of beauty, to cultivate a kind of, attractiveness which becomes a sort of a strength and, again, anti-fragility of its own. So I'm hopeful. I am hopeful, but I have been extremely frustrated, I would say, by the um basically I suppose it's natural. I don't really believe there exist, for the most part, pathways in our current culture to actually welcome the most generative conversations.
yeah,
Fundamentally,
totally,
I don't think the culture isn't set up to actually support
yeah,
um, what it takes to support generative conversation, which is itself wild. It's just that's a wild thing. That's a wild, absolutely wild thing. Um, and yeah, I'm just being consistently in relation to that, and I think part of what being in relation to that means, I think, for us, is that, and you've sort of evidenced this in the course of your own career, is there's you kind of have to, in a way, there's an attempt to sort of, well, I won't speak for you, but certainly you mentioned before when I was talking about the ecology and the mycelial, you said, oh, there's also a root. There's also a sort of a root context you're referring to that is built maybe on the other side of that transition across that hyphae, and there's something there. So it seems like it seems like doing a lot with little, with very little, is kind of necessary,
Yeah.
um, and possible.
Yeah.
It is possible, and
Yeah.
the remarkable thing is that it's possible to consistently open to be enriched by quality. Like
Yeah.
it's remarkable,
Yeah.
and it's incredible.
Completely open to being enriched by quality.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. So I think there's a Greek word for this, an ancient Greek word for this. I think they call that fumble fucking,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
This something like
Yeah.
this deeply improvisational, right? Generative, um, could collapse at any moment,
Mm,
invites all kinds of foolishness, right?
mm,
But could break open moments of dazzling beauty. You're right. There's a there's something, yeah, there's something that doesn't quite have the boundaries around it, right? Such that it's clearly a this, right? A this, and I can feel you reaching for that and trying to articulate that, and it does feel like that it's you're birthing a new distinction here, right?
mm,
In between something, right? That has become more and more distinct. And I would imagine in some sense, this it's one of the things that the internet has made more possible, right? In this way that we can really curate the kinds of conversations that we want to have, right? In this way that we've never been able to before, right? Like we can really, really, just think about like, I don't know, how many people in your neighborhood that you have direct contact and access with that like are even think, at all even know about a conversation like this or have these interests or something like this. These kinds of conversations were just so usually rare and space time location bound, right? So there is
mm,
something about like I'm wondering too. It's like there is something about this removing the distances, right, of the location. That seems that there's people that are gathering that are having the qualities of conversations that I would imagine usually was the like were the original intentions of the universities, right?
mm, mhm,
Like what humble and the original intention of the university, which was in some sense kind of like not something to prepare you for a career, right, but like something to
mhm,
evoke a kind of transformation in you, right?
mm,
in this in this network of relations, right, that you go through and you read the classics and you go through all of this without any like means to an end, but as kind of like an end in itself and a kind of transformation of this. I think
mm,
there's something to like this sense back there, right? But that's kind of emerging, right, by means of the internet. You know, thus your channel is like one of those, right? Totally, totally.
yeah. Yeah. It seems like, to put a bit of a neutral terminology on it, network philosophy, you
Yeah,
know, there's a role philosophy in the context of networks,
Yeah.
which is relevant, and then how poetically rich and relationally present
Yeah.
are we in relation to that opens up the possibility to know that by more
Yeah.
ecological metaphor,
Yeah.
which is more beautiful, I think, but certainly in the context of the internet, and obviously, clear links there in the context of the network. And you got people like Merlin Sheldrake, the mycologist, speaking about the wood wide web and what have you. So the metaphors between internet and then the way that mycelial and mycorrhizal fungal structures interact with the trees and the forest, and you just have all this, the capacity for exchange that seems to underlie so much of the health of what grows above it, let's say.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is all really, this is all really present for me. It's been good to see you again. I'm conscious of the time. I don't have too much longer, but
Really good to
it's
see
been too long. It's been good to see you too. And yeah, I'm glad we spoke.
me.
I'm confident it won't be such a long gap. And
Yes.
so I'll take responsibility for that as well. I'm
Yes.
enthused at the possibility for that. I'm enthused to take responsibility for that. So yeah. Um, and I'll just say as well that I've gotten to know a man named Michael and his partner named Vicky a little bit over the last year and a half of them being in Melbourne. And they are, you know, very much appreciative of your teaching. And so you've been a point of connection there as well. And
Yeah.
they're they're bringing forth that care in approach to wanting to connect with others that I that I know you care about and through circling. So
Yeah.
yeah,
You're awesome. Hi,
yeah,
Michael and Vicky.
yeah. I played tennis with Michael a couple of times. I played tennis with him a couple of times. We've had some fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Really good talking with you, my friend.
Good talking with you too. Take
Yes.
care, brother.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.